Okay, great. I guess we'll kick off then. Um, Welcome. Can people give a thumbs up if they can hear me? Great. Um, we're welcoming anyone who wants to turn on their camera, even if you're not speaking, not one of the official speakers here, because it's a small group and we want to make this as much of a conversation as possible. My name's Karen Fricker. I'm one of the participants in these next two discussions, which are presentations by myself and Keely WHITELAW about our circus research. And Keely's going to start. So Keely, could you tell the group, and thanks everyone for being here, just introduce yourself and your work as a circus researcher. And this is going to be a half an hour long conversation about Keely's research. And I'm going to be asking some questions, but we really invite everyone to ask questions as well, either in the chat or put up your hand and ask it out loud, because again, we want it to be conversational. So over to you, Keely.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Yes, sorry, I just got rid of my note to myself. Yeah, so I'm Keely. I am a circus artist. I do aerial, and I'm also a researcher at Concordia. So I'm in my doctoral research, in my third year. Yeah, so a little bit of kind of background about me, I suppose. I've had these kind of parallel lives as a circus artist and a mover, but also as an academic. So I did my master's, I did my bachelor and my master's in philosophy. And I really found circus while I was doing my master's. So I had this real feeling of parallel lives that felt like they really resonated with each other, but they didn't actually cross. So then at this time that everyone had to make some big decisions about directions of their lives, especially if you're in the performing arts in 2020, I kind of felt this was a good opportunity to make those paths intersect. So I started my doctoral research, and yeah, so when I got there, I kind of had this feeling that the kind of experience that I had of learning kind of conceptual things felt a lot like the process of learning a bit more like a technical kind of movement. I felt like they both really informed each other. So the way that I kind of like parsed through philosophical arguments became the way that I parsed through movements in order to learn them for myself as well as share them with others. But then I also had this sense of this experience of doing these kind of more acrobatic movements really influenced the way that I kind of thought outside of my body as well. So this ability to hold these kind of like paradoxical images or ideas of ways of moving, that you have to hold them together in order to do kind of any acrobatic or circusy movement. I realized that was really allowing me to, this kind of like felt experience was allowing me to work through these more contemporary philosophical ideas, which is what really brought me to phenomenology, specifically within philosophy. But then I kind of got to circus research, and as was kind of acknowledged earlier in some of the presentations, there is not a place to do circus research specifically, at least in Canada. So it became like, okay, is circus going to be a case study for thinking through these more philosophical things? But then I also had this like kind of frustrating feeling that I had to, and again, this is coming out of philosophy, and that I had to justify what embodied knowledge was to myself, which I don't know how necessary that truly is to do research. I think there are some things that you can just kind of accept to a certain degree, but it's brought me to thinking through things in phenomenology, like what is the role of imagination? How can we, and kind of going back to this, what we just heard from Hayley, this like almost knowing or embodied research by design. So not just that we kind of happen to be able to think about these things, but how can we use a circus practice to actually like notice the moments of imagination and where kind of motivation to move, not just like oh, I want to do it, but what actually drives the particular minute movements that allow acrobatic things to happen or not. So yeah, really interested in this relationship between kind of embodied imagination and then kind of sedimented memory. So we all move in these styles, and what influences those movement styles, how do we train them, and what kind of seeps in unconsciously, because these kinds of like plays between conscious and unconscious, musings, both physically and more intellectually, you can, a lot of things can go unnoticed because it's part of your kind of like null body, null position, null orientation, towards things. So I'm interested in kind of working through this kind of stuff, because I think a lot of these kind of applied social sciences, they take the phenomenological method and they kind of say, oh, it's just being really careful about noticing what you're feeling, and I feel like that isn't, it's not super useful, especially when it gets to circus, when there's so much to notice and experience and you can't intentionally notice it at all times. So how do these kind of things, yeah, influence what we're actually doing with our bodies? Yeah, so I find it kind of hard to talk about my research sometimes, because since it's rooted in philosophy, it gets really big really quickly. So if there's any applied things, yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be useful, Keely, to talk through briefly, like, what does this research process look like? I mean, when we did kind of a pregame, you told me that you're toward the end of doing your comprehensive exams. So can you talk about what your exams are in and how you put that together and what happens when you get through this point?
Mm-hmm. So yes, I'm in the middle of my exam. So the one that I'm studying for right now is my philosophy comp, which is why I'm kind of stuck in these like abstract ideas about imagination, etc. So my other exams were kind of one was in dance performance studies. The other one was in circus studies. So in the circus one, what I did was kind of read a bunch of things that people had written and thought about how kind of movement styles developed within different kind of sects of circus, but also what some of our more cultural implicit biases are, such that we judge the aesthetics in a certain way. So where were some of these lineages coming from? Are we just judging these like good lines of circus based on ballet? So kind of looking a little bit through historical lens in order to do that. And one of my kind of outcomes of my research is that I really hope to be able to formalize or make a little bit more clear some teaching methods of these kind of fundamental acrobatic aerial techniques. Because so much of it, now that it's kind of exploding into the mainstream, people are learning by themselves or teaching in really unsustainable ways, and they're not even kind of noticing what some of these implicit directions or biases are. So I'm interested in I really analyze my own practice. That's really the site of a lot of my research right now, kind of trying to notice what I'm doing, what I'm paying attention in order to change my style of movement. Yeah, so this is a big part of
And does your PhD research involve a performance or physical component? Are you making circus, and will you be examined on the making of circus?
I am making it, but I don't think I am doing it in such a way that I will be then examined on it. I'm sure that's largely out of a place of kind of lack of confidence in my artistic voice. So what I'm kind of looking into now is how can I create like a workshop that can be shared with people, that then they do kind of artistic explorations on a more critical question, and then reflecting on how they absorb that, how they who are maybe have a bit more of a rigorous artistic practice are kind of taking some of my ideas. Yeah, so it's not going to be a research creation of my own, but I'm interested in developing methods to help other people do kind of more critical reflection research through their own creation.
And so is creating or kind of manifesting or promoting better circus pedagogy part of your research question, or will that maybe be a really cool offshoot of what comes out of your PhD, or is it more, is that a central goal?
I'm not quite sure how heavily it will play out in kind of the end of it. There's a chance it'll just be an offshoot, but it's definitely the offshoot that I see as most applicable to the artistic community as it stands.
And I asked you a question they haven't followed up on yet, which is what happens after the comps, but maybe can we double back to when you applied for the PhD at Concordia, were you required to apply with a research question? And if so, what was it? And is that still the question that you're pursuing? Or am I not understanding the application process correctly?
No, you did have to, or I did have to give a kind of research question. It's definitely something that I look back on now. I'm like, why did anyone accept this as a research question? It's very vague, and yeah, the outcomes are very unclear. So since then, I've kind of in applying for SSHRC had to fine tune the question a little bit. It's again changed a lot since then. This is something that I'm noticing. Like as you write something, you think it's going to be the be all end all, and then it simply isn't. Yeah, so I think my most recent kind of research question was, how can we use phenomenology and its methods to kind of appropriate methods from things like Access syllabus in the dance world and this kind of embodied, what does she call it? Embodied critical research that someone in the States is kind of doing this with aerial. So my kind of research question is, how do we take these existing models, kind of the really broad phenomenological method, the way that it's been kind of taken up in a certain area of contemporary dance, and then how it's being used kind of in the academy. How can we kind of smush all these things together to create a model of doing this kind of like embodied critical research by kind of coming up with your own question, like, okay, I want to investigate kind of how I represent my gender in the world. How do you take that kind of like question that's in words, metabolize it through your body, and then allow an answer or a musing to come out in movement as opposed to in words?
And has your process thus far involved a relay between working in an embodied way and working in a more kind of traditional book learning academic way?
I think it's definitely stayed in the book learning place for the most part. I've kind of experimented with myself and like a couple of close friends to start to bring some of these questions like into the studio. But that's, yeah, and this is kind of why I think that my research project as a whole is probably going to end up being more written word rather than research creation presentation.
Does anybody have any questions thus far for Mathilde? I mean, not Mathilde, Keely. I can keep going, but I'm also eager to hear if anybody has anything they want to jump in on at this point. Okay. Can you I was unable to be at the previous parts of today's activities before now, and Keely, you mentioned that there's been a discussion about where one does circus research, presumably in North America or maybe anywhere, and how do you get something like that going? And I guess I have a question about community. Are you part of a circus research community in your experience?
And how did you find it, and how does it manifest itself?
I think that's been one of the hardest things to kind of reconcile. I came to, so I don't really feel like I'm part of like a strong circus research community. I feel like I've found certain individuals along the way. So like some in Newfoundland where I am right now, some in Toronto, some in Montreal. But there never really felt like there was a place to gather beyond just like on a day to day. And I also kind of felt going to Montreal, not having some of the more like professional credentials. I didn't feel super welcomed to just kind of speak candidly with people. It kind of felt like no one, that research was kind of over there, but people doing their kind of artistic research are over here, and it didn't feel like the use of the word research was actually something that was like bringing these two groups together. It kind of felt like they were just passing each other. Yeah, because I don't kind of, some of the working groups that were going on, some of the things that were happening in the city and elsewhere seemed to have kind of like fizzled out by the time I got to them.
But when you said that you felt like there was something happening that was embodied research or artistic research that you didn't feel you were connecting with, was that happening in an academic setting? Was it happening in the National Circus School? Or I mean, where, and are there linguistic issues at play because you are coming to this from an Anglophone background?
Yeah,
Linguistic and cultural, I guess. Yeah.
I felt like that was a big kind of like difference. Yeah, I was kind of noticing that people at the National Circus School, and even just people in some of the training space, would talk about like, oh, I'm doing this research, and they were talking about really like technical research. Oh, I'm trying to figure out these different ways in and out of this movement, different ways to execute it. But then, and again, this is like one of the reasons that I chose not to pursue just like straight philosophy, is that I feel like that language is really hard to get into as well. So I didn't feel like, I felt like the language that I had, I couldn't translate it either culturally or like kind of culturally francophone to anglophone, but also like academic into a more embodied kind of language. I didn't feel like I could really translate that, and that was one of the reasons that I kind of went in this direction, because I felt like I had this strong, oh, these are doing the same thing in these two different spheres and I don't know how to put them together. Yeah, but then I didn't necessarily, or I haven't yet found a lot of people that wanted to kind of go into the studio and talk about these things and do them. The shyness post-COVID did not help.
And can you talk about what happens after you finish your comps? What's the timeline? And can you talk about the supervisors, the committee that you're working with, and how that process works? Because I'm working in the assumption that there's some people who are here who might not be in an academic context, might not have done a PhD. And so I'm asking you almost a technical question, which is, how does this work?
Yeah. So the program that I'm in is the Interdisciplinary Humanities program, which is a bit of a strange program, in that you don't just have one supervisor. Like most other programs, it seems you can have one person, then you have a supporting team. But this is really meant to be, you create a team of 3 people in 3 different fields and you bring it together. At the comp stage, what I'm at right now, I do an exam with each of those supervisors. So the first one I did with Dr. MJ Thompson, who really works in dance and performance. So we looked at, we read a bunch of things kind of together, or she helped me create a list, and then I would go and read it, and then we'd get together and talk about it. And then I wrote a paper that kind of summarized a lot of these things. So in effect, doing like a literature review, and looking at kind of how technique has evolved, and kind of the attitude towards technique, and all these movements of kind of getting away from technique in the contemporary dance world. so kind of a lot of the questions I was interested in circus, but through the much more developed academic world of dance. Then the second one I did with Patrick LaRue. I just finished that in the fall, and that was when we kind of, I read through history of circus and then looked at some of these, like, what kind of cultural, kind of, how could you see some of these like larger cultural trends from within the circus, and how has historically circus been an outlier but also a microcosm of these kind of attitudes out in the world. And then I also kind of looked at some pedagogical approaches to teaching circus, kind of keeping that historical and cultural lens intact. And then, so what I'm doing now is working with David Morris, and I'm reading a bunch of kind of phenomenology and things that rub up against it and how it kind of shifts. So I'm reading a bunch of Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, but then also looking at how kind of like temporalities, ideas of memory and forward projection are kind of present in places like, or people like Bergson. So it's kind of, so what I'm kind of like deep in right now is only peripherally. I'm kind of keeping my circus questions in my side view, or in my periphery, but not necessarily looking directly at them. So then write a paper about this, and then what I'll do after that is take those three major points in each of the kind of papers that I wrote, and then re-synthesize what my research question is. So I feel like I'm kind of in the depths of the chaos of that right now. So if they're like, oh, what was your research question? Is like, oh, that's a good question. I don't remember what it was, because it's very much kind of has some like tectonic shifts going on right now. So then I'll kind of bring that all together into and write a final, nothing's ever final, kind of proposal for my dissertation based on what I found really interesting in each of the three fields in the comp.
Great, thank you. Irena, I hope I've said your name correctly. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I hope I'm going to be able to formulate it. I'm listening to you, and I wonder, you talked about coming into the circus environment in Montreal, and I totally understand. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just need to find that one or two people who kind of open the door, and there's a connection, and then there is an exchange. And research puzzles me, but circus puzzles me. I love circus, and circus is my life. And sometimes, we talk about things, but we don't talk about things too much. Like, very often there is this physical component that is very important, and I have listening to you, sometimes my brain takes me elsewhere, so I have to always keep my concentration here. But I wonder how you seek those connections, because I'm looking for, listening to you, I'm looking for images. I'm looking for, did you come with images from acrobats? Did you show your own work? Do you try to talk with, like, how do you create that connection? And the reason I'm asking this is because I feel the work we do, and I'm sure it's the same for you, it very quickly feels very personal, even though we are not alone and we are having maybe that same experience, everybody, but there is this very strong feeling of personal that I think sometimes it's difficult. Yeah. So how do you approach, how do you stimulate the conversation around things?
Mm-hmm. The like real personalness is kind of, first of all, what kind of drove me to it, but then I spent quite a bit of time in the first 2 years of my program kind of trying to disentangle my personal psychology from the kind of more overarching trends of how psychological processes happen. So I was really worried about it being too personal and being too much of my own, just like what my own kind of hangups were. So yeah, that's something that I definitely struggle with a little bit. But yeah, this question of like, do I have images? I feel like that's what really my driving thing is. Like I have these kind of images that I feel that I like to create, but that I feel are really representative of these kind of bigger kind of philosophical concepts. And that's what I try to like connect with people on, whether that's if I'm kind of like trying to teach a certain spin technique or something. Like I always try to bring it back to this image of kind of filling a space, like making a sphere of space, and then always and trying to kind of get your various limbs to the edges of it. Yeah, and I think that that's where I've had kind of success making movement phrases that I aesthetically like, but then it kind of delineates, because there's so many different styles, especially like, so I work mostly in hoop, but mostly just like in even more generally like spinning aerial apparatuses. So kind of to be able to root it in an image, like, okay, if you spin, like when you're spinning, you create this axis around which you're moving, and then it makes this kind of three-dimensional space around you. How can we think about not just like, okay, you put this hand here, you move through in this way, but instead like, what are the axes that we're creating with our own body that then you can turn around, and how do you make those things visible? Because it's that kind of image of like what becomes visible that isn't visible in itself, like this, like the axis around which you spin. Like it's not a physical thing unless you're on a pole, but you can create movements that make it visible. So what is it that you're like bringing out in your movement, in both an image, and then how does that image of like, oh, you've made a thing around which you're oriented, how does that then map on to this kind of more conceptual, like, oh, there's always this it's always like you up against the world, and you can't, these kind of like phrases of, oh, you can't feel touching and being touched at the same time. It's always this like pass back and forth between one experience or the other, like you're either the thing touched or the thing touching. And so kind of creating these images of, okay, well, you are making kind of the case or the sort of like the conditions. You're kind of making the conditions against which you act, but they couldn't possibly be there until you created them, because they're somehow like they're both you and in the world. So this kind of like creating that image that then you can reflect back on and have these more kind of philosophical conversations. Like that's how I try to interact with artists that don't have the kind of the same language. And I want to get away, like I don't think that language is the most effective way to engage with these kinds of thoughts.
Thanks. That was a great question and a great answer. I see Dana has a question. Well, after Dana's question and your response, I think we need to flip because it's been about a half an hour, but I'm delighted to hear what Dana wants to know or say.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana, for anybody who doesn't know me, but good to see you, Keely and Karen, from like, what, a month ago?
Different world.
I know. Sorry, I just like came off of a train, so I'm like was rushing here. But I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about, because what I'm getting at is that you would identify your research as research creation. Is that correct? Like that's the way you would identify, or you're kind of on the cusp of there, you're trying to decide that's what you're doing.
And largely because I really felt I had to justify research creation as like a legitimate path to knowledge because I had spent so long in my head.
Oh, okay. So like you're not even sure if research creation is valid?
I believe it now, but I
Okay,
had to.
okay. No, sorry. We could have a whole chat about that one. For those of you who don't know, I am also getting my PhD in the same program as her, and I also use research creation as my primary method. But I think what I wanted to ask is if you could give an example of a little bit about how you're talking. The question before was about the image and the research, how it tied, I guess what I'm trying to find out is could you give an example of how the image or the movement that you're talking about connects with the philosophy that you're currently looking at? So this movement between theory and practice, is there an example of how you feel that the practice is feeding the theory and the theory is feeding the practice? So like the image and the writing versus, yeah, does that make sense?
So some of the kind of theory that I've been working with is how does history sediment in your body, and how do these kinds of like ways of being in the world sediment such that they then influence in the future what you're able to imagine and what kind of like how the world presents itself, because we're always like, it's always this question of perception. You can't move into something that you can't perceive, or like the options of moving that are apparent to you are only made apparent kind of through your history. So it's always this interplay of like what's sedimented and then how you're motivated to move. So yeah, so when I think of kind of like a technique, if you're thinking of like, okay, you're kind of spinning and you want to invert, okay, you can't just invert straight because, and first of all, convincing people of that who haven't had the experience of trying to invert in a spin, they don't really believe you. They're like, no, I'll be able to. So this idea of like, no, like really visualizing what the forces are and how you can kind of slip into that and use it as leverage that isn't a physical thing. I really feel like this is kind of like almost the internalized dialectic or something. Like you think you have these rules about the world that your really basic philosophy was based on. Oh, you have a subject and an object, and like you can't, like all the examples that they use to kind of explain that. It takes a long time to kind of get out of that, but then once you have this other kind of more like spiraling approach to moving through thought experiments, then this whole other way of thinking kind of reveals itself to you. But if you haven't been kind of introduced into a mode of thinking in this more like processual way, you're like, no, I continually just have to like, oh, I get upside down by getting my hips up. So I feel like these kind of images, like, okay, no, it's a spiraling that you always like slip in and turn over. This feels for me like the way to start thinking about that kind of like spiraling thing that you're slipping into is itself kind of the conceptual framework in which you're thinking. And once you have that basic feeling, then you can get a little bit more like expressive at the edges and, oh, how do I make this an actual flare? How do I make this something else? How do I talk more specifically about like what kind of embodied imagination is like? But you can't do that until you have the experience of doing the thing. Like you can't modulate it until you have that first basic thing.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering if like I know you're like on a time schedule. Sorry, Carrie. I'm just wondering if actually, I know you're not sure if you wanted to bring in, like, I always have a video attached with my research to help, because a lot of times what we're dealing with is not having the language to express it. And I think it's its own language. And I think that there could be some way for you to bring in an image of what you're actually describing right now to help, because I really think that it is its own language in and of itself. Like I strongly believe that. And so it's like there's always that tension between the theory and the practice, but how can we make that productive? How can we make the knowledge come from that tension, because they're kind of a paradox a bit, you know. And so I just think that like it could be very interesting to just actually move between the image and the writing and see how it's moving thought because of the that you're doing in the image that you're describing. Anyways, that's a lot of comment more than question, but anyways.
No, but I think that is exactly like what all of this kind of research is getting towards, is this like inherent paradox that we're kind of thinking the same thing in both of these realms, but in totally different languages, so they always pass each other. So yeah, how do you bring in the image to strengthen what you're saying kind of in this different mode?
Like for me, I will have a video that is its own language that goes with the dissertation, just like I did in my master's. They have equal, like it's kind of a political reason for me to do it in the academic world, but like for them to hold equal weight in their own languaging. So anyways, thank you for that. Sorry, I don't mean to.
No, and I think I would love to do that. I feel like I need to like make my research question a little bit more. I feel like I'm in a really hard place to be like, oh, this is what the image is going to be, because that my question to myself isn't quite clear.
Oh
so
yeah,
I'm
but
like dancing around these two sides, and I know that you're going to say, oh, it's in doing it. It clarifies.
No, but that's the nature of it, right? Like
yeah.
And a lot of times it's the question comes from the movement. The question comes. I'm at the end of writing and I'm still like, what exactly is my I mean, I'm you know, I'm swirling about a lot of questions. So I think that there's this sort of having to sit with the discomfort of not knowing that and allowing it to reveal itself. And that yeah, anyways.
So maybe if I could, I can see a way that I can do an elegant segue. So thanks Dana and Keely and Irena. So for the remainder of the time, I'm going to switch to talk about my research project, which is called Circus and Its Others. And it's familiar to some of you. Keely and Dana were talking about the fact that a month ago, I think, we were at a conference in Bogota in Colombia that was the 4th Circus and Its Others conference. It's an international research project. And the segue that I see is this idea of the paradoxical relationship between the academic thought and the embodied action, and how do those things inform each other. And so that's to me a question of otherness within circus, I suppose. Like, is academic thought other to practice and embodied knowledge? What is the relationship of circus practice to the academic world of circus, which, as we know, in North America is not really constituted as a field. It's extremely scattered, and you know, we're constantly having to reinvent the contexts in which we do circus research, because it's not constituted as a field. So the Circus and Its Others grew out of the world of Quebec circus research, of which I became a part, I suppose, in around 2007. Because I come from the world of circus theater research. My PhD is in theater studies. I wrote my PhD about Robert Lepage. So I was working in Quebec theater studies. And I was working within a small group of people who do Quebec theater research, and particularly in English. That's a tiny group of people. And the we in this is Patrick Leroux, who's already been mentioned, and Aaron Hurley. So Patrick's at Concordia, soon to go to an institution in Ottawa. Aaron is at McGill. And we kind of went, oh, we're kind of missing a trick here, not looking at circus as a part of the world of performance in Quebec, because it actually is like such a huge part. And we weren't talking about it in theater and performance studies, I think because that was out of our disciplinary lane. Like, how do I talk about that? And so we started to have some really great conversations and experiences where we thought, well, what would it mean to become circus researchers? And so there were trips to Vegas, and a lot of reading and discussion. And Patrick started the Montreal Working Group on Circus Research. And in our various ways, we found our way into a world that somewhat existed and somewhat didn't, and have followed it in different pathways, done some publications, done some conferences. Patrick co-edited a book with Charles Batson, and it is Charles and myself who started Circus and Its Others, and it grew out of a conversation that we were starting to have about how, given that circus is such a big set of industries in Quebec, and it's been mainstreamed in a lot of ways, was circus still a haven for the difference, the other, the freak, the queer? How was normativity functioning in circus practices? Because we saw a lot of pretty gender normative performances. And that to a certain extent comes from, the fact that the traditionally large men have thrown small women into the air. And now I think those of us who know circus know that some of that stuff is really starting to be challenged, and we're seeing more playing around with gender and bodies and gendering in circus. And so I think there's been a lot of evolution happening. When we started to ask these questions in about 2013, 2014, we just thought we found these questions super generative and provocative between ourselves. And so we asked those questions in the form of a call for papers to a conference. And the response that we got was amazing, and what we were really hoping for, in that it was super interdisciplinary, because we had people coming to that question from geography, from political science, from gender studies. Charles is in the Department of French. I'm a theater person. And some people coming from circus practice, some people coming from existing circus research worlds in Quebec. And it was a really exciting moment when we had our first conference in 2016 in Montreal, next to the Montreal Complètement Cirque Festival. It was like we found our people found us, and we found our people, in that trying to just ask questions about when we say other and circus, when we say difference in circus, when we say alterity, when we talk about the relationship of thought to embodiment, just the kinds of things that people wanted to talk about and bring to the table, and the interdisciplinary conversations that it provoked were just so exciting. So we a peer-reviewed double issue of a journal came out, Performance Matters, that I co-edited with Hayley Malouin, who's now doing a PhD in political science at Carleton. And so we started to publish the work, and a lot of the people who came to us were emerging scholars, graduate students, some folks who were circus artists who moved into circus studies, like you have too, Keely. And so we were in a lot of instances, these were first publications for folks, and that was really exciting to be a part of. So we've had 3 conferences since then, one in Prague, one that was meant to be in California at UC Davis that ended up being online, but UC Davis was our host. And we just had one in Bogota that was not next to an existing circus festival. Our amazing colleague, Olga Lucio Sorzano, made us a festival, and it turned out to be just, Charles and I had no idea how massive this festival actually was. And it was, I have to say, quite thrilling and overwhelming to see, and all of the performances were free, and there was a lot of Latin American circus artists, some circus artists and acts from elsewhere. And the Bogota public came out, and there were queues around the block to see these shows, and lots of outdoor performances. And it was that was, I'm still processing how major that was, and alongside incredible papers and presentations and panels that we heard over 4 days at the conference. And that is a huge long sentence I just spoke about Circus and Its Others. Is there anything you'd like to ask me about it, Keely, or should I just keep going?
No, so I'm curious how, so you kind of came to the feeling that this needed to exist from a pretty strictly academic place, but in all cases, it seems it's alongside the festival. So I'm wondering about this, kind of going back to this question about like these two different modes of knowing, how kind of what the effort to not just have them in these parallel lives, because that it sometimes it feels like, and not that there's anything wrong with circuses being like the subject of research, but a lot of people are really wanting it to become like a site of research, which is exactly what Dana's kind of research creation is all about. So I'm wondering, how what you do to kind of not keep them just alongside, but how the conference and the festival, because they really do kind of, you get the experience of like this enmeshment. So yeah, I'm wondering how you kind of foster that and how you see that going forward.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for the question, and it's super important to us. I mean, I am aware, when we're doing circus studies, we're talking about something that is artists making stuff, right? It's artists expressing themselves. It's an embodied form. It has a history. It has a presence. And we never wanted to have something where we were just talking about something in an abstract way without involving people who do it and without involving the doing of it itself. That just doesn't make any sense to me and to Charles, who was a dancer who became a dance scholar who then now works in a French department, but he's as those of you who know him, he's a very embodied person. And so when we were in the Montreal working group on circus research, which is where we met, Patrick was doing that. It was at Concordia, but we would often meet at the National Circus School, and working alongside and with artists, with the research center that's now in the ANC. So we were never wanting to be outside or away from the practice of circus. And so it's more than symbolic that we have always been next to and in partnership with and dialogue with circus festivals, and we have the conferences, because we want that relay and to be central, so that artists can both make work in a festival and talk about their work in the conference, so that we in the conference can go see stuff and then talk about it as part of the conference. And I mean, I feel like that took on a really interesting new layer in Bogota, because one of the things that Olga, who's our Colombian partner, who's based in Bogota and does not have a university appointment, she has a PhD, but she's very much a circus researcher and a circus producer. And circus research in Colombia, at least, is very much happening through artists who are interested in their skill or their apparatus, or artists who have become historians, but this is not happening within the academy. It's happening because they got a government grant to write the history of Colombian circus, or because they have a passionate interest in juggling and they have amassed a lot of knowledge about juggling. The idea of this even happening within an academic context is not really part of the culture there yet. And so I think Olga wanted us to bring our studies to her environment, just to offer as an offering, to say, here's some ways in which people are thinking and talking about circus in other contexts and in other academic other academic systems. How might we respond to that here? And what the response was to that and what the outcome of that, I think, is still to come. We don't know, because it was a packed 4 to 5 days, so many presentations, so much stuff going on. And so how that's really going to resonate in the Latin American context is something that it's really exciting to know that we're going to see how that plays out in the months and years to come. And I don't want that to sound like a top-down global north coming to the global south to tell them how to do it message, because I don't intend that at all. it was high time for Circus and Its Others to go to the Global South. And to have a lot of our, I'll say my, I don't know, ways of thinking, epistemologies, ways of understanding what thinking is, what moving is, what bodies are, have new ways of approaching really significant questions by encountering some of the work and some of the thought that we did. So it really affected Charles and me, I know, in terms of thinking about what the futures of Circus and Its Others might be. And I don't have any answers yet, but we have a lot of questions.
Yes, Dana.
I just wanted to say a comment more than a question, except that just as having been a person who participated, I don't even know if anybody's still here listening. It might just be us. But just to tell you from my perspective, just as not an organizer, but a participant that did both the festival and the conference, that I really felt like you were building an ecology. You were building a community. It didn't feel top down. And I feel like just to have the in-person contact, because it was such a different experience than the online, to have that face-to-face because of the power of presence. So anyways, I think that, yeah, it was very special what happened in Colombia. And I think that I don't think it's something you can recreate except just to build on, and I think that was great. So thank you for all that.
Thanks, Dana. And yeah, I mean, now that we're here, it's like, it was really special. But because conferences and festivals are so important, because they are not just about what happened in the presentation room. They're about the corridor conversation. They're about going for drinks after the performance. They're about spontaneous encounters and something, I think, in the form of, validation sounds like too cheap a word for the community and the sense of those of us who are interested in this, in studying and researching this embodied art form through different ways of coming at it, for us to come together and to commune. I think is really, I have found every time has been really meaningful. And because it's a lot of work putting on a conference, and the seeing and hearing how important it is to those who come along to be in community in that way is really goes a long way in making us feel like, okay, this is important, we need to keep doing this.
Oh yeah, I think that when earlier there was a talking about like a feeling dispersed and not like Keely and I barely spoke, and we've been in the same program for a long time. It's how to start creating those bonds of community so that and I think that these are helping to, even if it's very spread across the world, it's something that's pulling people together. There's a gravitational pull, or that the conference and the festival bring. And it was like, when I did the Circus Festival with Chicago, we started having panels because I was very interested in just trying to find the language to speak about what I was doing, which is ultimately why I came to Circus Academia, was because I wanted to be able to speak in a language that was outside of my own embodied language. And I think that that's the beauty of bringing that in, even if it's not fully just the process of bringing it in proximity helps to facilitate that. Because even when I first came into academia, the practitioners, my fellow professionals, were just so skeptical. They're like, why are you doing it? They're very skeptical because most of the research was coming from the outside in. So to really try to cultivate this inward outward in the circus, it's great work. So I have a lot of empathy and compassion and gratitude for what you do, because it is an insane amount of work and you're doing the job for like 12 people. And I think that I've been going to the Montreal Circus Festival since it started. And I was so happy when it started because it offered that opportunity to have those kind of undercommoning, those things that were outside all the formalities of the festival, to have that. So anyways. Thank you again.
Thank you. And just to follow up for anybody who is still here, that the knowledge relay that now is that we are going to be publishing 2 special issues of journals out of the conference, because for academics, it is important to have publications, and it is, and I do like, I feel you, Keely, like the struggle to actually put it into words of what it is that you're trying to do and trying to say is so hard. But it's so important to get it written down, because we are trying to do a knowledge relay, right? That embodied knowledge is so important. Performance is ephemeral. We do need records. We do need to document what is being thought and felt and performed in circus and in these festival contexts. And I mean, I have an image in my mind now, which is at our conference, that our lovely colleague Asta from India, we tasked her with physically recording anything that happened in the conference that wasn't a pre-written paper, because we know that so much happens in the question period after the paper or in the discussion after the performance. And she took her job very seriously and did it very well. And so now we thankfully have in the cloud these recordings. And so part of the job of the public, of us publishing, is we are going to invite people who gave papers to present, to offer a more, a publishable version of their paper that is probably informed by what happened in the conference, but we're also going to try and write down some of those exchanges to grab those thoughts and feelings in the moment that can otherwise disappear. And that's super important.
Yeah, are you going to do like a video format where you can do like a video essay? Is that going to be offered?
We hope so. We're still figuring out what the capabilities are in each of the journals. I know that both of the journals, I mean, one of them is a circus journal. It's Circus, Arts, Life, and Science. And the other one is a journal called Corpographias, which has to do with embodiment. So one hopes and expects that we are going to find a way to have video documentation as well as written documentation. I can't say for sure yet because we're in the very early stages, but that's certainly the desire.
Yeah. Because the writing is the hardest part about this PhD. Right?
Oh, totally.
I love being in the studio working through the ideas, but getting it in a form that that it's the hardest part. So, but it's very important, like you said. So.
And I wonder if, and this is kind of like, I wonder if you could almost do, so much happens kind of in the meeting outside of the formal speaking. So I'm wondering if there's also a way to kind of integrate like, it's like a workshop component. So someone presenting their idea, not as a paper, not as because it is really hard to write down, but to like have the opportunity to, Dana, if you were like, oh, well, these are kind of the basic things I'm grappling with. Let's all go in the studio and I'll kind of prompt you through some of the things, or like kind of almost inviting people into like the research creative process, because it's so hard to articulate in words because it doesn't happen in words. And then it's really hard to imagine like this kind of question of the personal, to get outside of your own personal thing. So that was almost what I was really craving. Like there were some opportunities, kind of like the open stage during the day that people were kind of jamming on. But to have that almost like one step more formalized, like somebody leading it, so that then you can kind of all together embody this question and kind of see what comes out of it. That kind of seems like, there's this one direction of you're watching the shows and discussing them and blah blah, but there isn't really an opportunity to do the opposite direction of like, how do I metabolize this new thought, this new way of whatever kind of in my body.
I have a thought about that. I will say, I feel we're right at time, but I also think that Mathieu is going to tell us when we need to stop. So let's just keep going. What were you going to say, Dana?
No, I was going to, I mean, Keely and I talked a lot, but my goal is when I finish this process, which hopefully will be sooner than later, that I would love to, it's like actually something I would love to, there's something that resonates for me in my dramaturgical practice about the specificity and the personal part of that process, where it's so hard to articulate what it is, because it kind of goes against method, which is one of the things that are so important in the academic world, is a kind of method that you can reproduce over and over and over again that sort of legitimizes the knowledge. But in research creation, it's very difficult. And in dramaturgical thinking and practice, it's also not a method that you can just keep reproducing over and over. It's something that you have to start to grow and cultivate as an individual and figure out how it pulls itself out into the world and presents itself and manifests. But that's I would love to do that at some point. But we're probably going to practice that a little bit, Keely, right? Like we have a little plan to do it together anyway.
Yes. Yeah. But again, like so much of, and again, not that this is a bad thing, but so much of like circus is one individual meets another individual, something comes out of it, and that's really amazing. But to have like a mechanism within this kind of ecosystem that you're creating, to not just like completely leave it up to chance that somebody is going to be like, oh, I'm real, like this is what I want to do, I'm really interested. Like there was, not that you have to formalize the method, but to kind of like create a little space and time container that kind of work is encouraged, feels like it would help to legitimize that as kind of like a site of things.
Yeah. I'm going to say one more thing, Karen, before I know that you want to say something, but I will say that the way that I've thought about it is I didn't do it this year, but for 5 years I was teaching a dramaturgy workshop at Studio 303 where it was about dramaturgical thinking. And we got in a room together and there were readings that we spoke around, and there were practical exercises and practical examples. And we just talked about it. It was a discussion that we exchanged ideas, and it was some way that things started to take shape for people, for themselves, through those discussions. Because it's one thing to see it, it's one thing to read it, but then to say it out loud, it's another modality of expression that allows things to form another sort of side of the question. Anyway, sorry, I'll let you talk.
That's okay. I am involved in examining a PhD imminently, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say where it is and who it is, but it's in a European country where they do this really well. And part, it seems to me, of this person's project, and this person might be someone we know, is about the relay between making and documenting. And so it's a research creation project where a piece is being performed, and then the documentation is being published, or made available to the people involved in the examination process. And I'm super excited because happened to have seen the piece at a recent festival in South America, I now get to figure out what all of the pieces were. And so it's like reconstructing a project that became a performance, but also comes deeply from philosophy and deeply from embodied practice. And it seems to me like, I think a meta narrative of what's going on is that this is also about documentation. This is also about how we document a thought and feeling process. And I too am very excited by trying to grasp that ineffable thing and bring into scholarship not just the thing that was made, but some kind of record of how it got made. And what does that look like?
I know who you're talking about. I'm sure I know who you're talking about. Yeah. We had quite a few discussions, and I think I got a text message this morning also. Okay. No, but if it's the same person, I would concur. So we've had a lot of conversations about, and it's an exciting prospect, because I think that there's something that one of the things I get excited about Circus and Its Others, it's like, oh, I get to geek out or nerd out with some people with as much energy I have. It's so overwhelming in a good way, but it's to create a reason to come around and have those discussions, and PhDs and projects are one of those things that allow. So that's like reading or practical stuff yeah, maybe it will happen at the next Circus and Its Others, or it can just happen. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when we're talking about the futures of Circus and Its Others, which is a very hot topic at the moment, the idea, and one of the ideas that's just been tabled is working groups, like because that is happening a lot around established conferences, that they have sub conferences within conferences, so that people can really pursue a question over 5 days or even over 2 years, and then come together for the conference, but you have something going. So, you know, and so if there was a performance documentation working group, or you know, performance theory relay working group,
We're all reading the same thing.
yeah, we're all reading the same thing. So that would be super interesting. So how do we get to the last word?
Oh, I don't know. I was on a train and I couldn't get reception, and I just got off the train and ran to my sister's place. But yeah.
Keely, so you were at the conference before, and so it wasn't on this channel?
I thought it was.
I thought it was all on this channel.
Yeah.
That's
But
what
I
my
don't- yeah, so I
understanding
don't know
was.
how to switch.
Yeah.
out.
Maybe they put us in a room, but we can wrap it up. But I will
Yeah.
say that I did a project with Bauka. Bauka had a Smells Like Circus festival where Thinking Circus was published, and I was there. And she did do these tables of work where there was a kind of a rotation, and I actually had I was the leader for the other table, the other. But it was really interesting because there were a lot of practitioners there, and the conversations were very rich, because there's something very important to me about having available to the practitioner to feel safe, to create the conditions for them to want to come and talk with the academics, which is, yeah. So.
Yeah, there's taking these ideas forward is really exciting to me, and I'm glad that you guys have something that you might be doing together. So thank you. and
you.
best of luck, Keely, with the final comp and what comes next. And Dana, best of luck with the write-up.
Yes.
Yeah,
I just
great
got
job.
my video back though, so that helps.
What's the
Is it,
video from where? From Bogota?
From my studio presentation that I did last year. So it was
Cool.
it was just about a year ago, and I had a videotape, which I'm doing very different than the one I did for my master's. And so I'm just getting the first round of edits for it, which I'm excited for. I think, yeah, it helps because I've been trying to just conjure from my memory, but it's nice to see it.
And it's not black light, white noise.
It is. It's black light, white noise. It's double Dutch. It's flesh as a portal. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to do it more as a video essay, I think. I'm going to have it, I'm going to have two portions. I'm going to have it without the video, without the essay, and then I'm going to layer it, kind of what I was experimenting with at the conference, where I'll layer a sort of a theory on top of the video to see what it's doing. I'm interested in seeing what that will do. But I'd like to have it written where people could read it, to see it, but then also to see it smashed together. So yeah, but black light, white noise will be there. And there was another piece that was Flesh as a Portal, which never got to be finished because I had cancer and I just ran out of time.
So, but do you have a record of it in some way? I mean,
yeah.
You captured what there was?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There is. It's all, it was very important to me, just like I did in my master's. All of the work that it will have some sort of visual component that is deposited. Like right now, there'll be for my master's, they had this spectrum where we deposited was the written and the video art together. It'll be very similar. And it's nice that I've already done it at Concordia, so I know how it's working. It's one of the reasons why I stayed at Concordia, because it's so hard to know how the university works, especially in a burgeoning field like circus. And you're just like, I cannot do this work again at another university. Like, I know how it works here, I know where I could do research.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Yeah, and yeah, I was the kind of not having like a real true research creation project, like came out of some of my own insecurities, but I was also strongly encouraged not to because it was too hard.
research creation was
Yes.
well, it is. It's very daunting. You know how many times I sat in the studio and like, what the hell is embodied knowledge? Like that was me. And when you were launching Circus and Its Others for the first time, I was there actually, and that's when I was starting my academic journey. And during the master's, it was so much sitting there like, what is the hell is embodied knowledge? I really just did not have the words, and it's a lot of just sitting there because you talk a lot about imagination, and you in circus we don't have a lot of space for that because it's so technical and we train with so many bodies and it's go 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 that there's never any space to feel the sedimented anything. And so even just sitting there, you're doing work. Like Buddhists will say meditation is a work, but it's like you're doing work, but it doesn't feel like, because circus you have that tension, you're like, I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing it, no, I'm not doing. And I could, when I would be at the National Circus School, like sitting on the bar for 10 minutes upside down while somebody's like doing a heel hang, you know, porting somebody in a heel hang on their neck. The disparity between, they're like, what is she doing in the corner over there, just sitting there for 10 minutes? But yeah. So, but
so did either of you have space to physically work at Concordia?
no, it doesn't exist. I looked, well, the one place was the black box, and I had to get, because I did most of my rigging because of the United States, I got a license to do the lift so I could do my own rigging. So I was able to do my trapeze and anything that was rigged there. But because my PhD is like, because of the pandemic and the direction it went, there's so much about doing trapeze without trapeze that I didn't end up having to rig. But there's nothing. And Munster, like the church wasn't there before. The only place I could do it was applying for residencies with the ENC. And so I was doing it at the National Circus School. That was where I was able to do it. Because Aaron was it's just busy. You know, it's hard to do research when you don't have the quiet, and that's not part of the culture.